Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our deep dive today on one of the most prevalent threats facing banks and their customers today: authorized push payment or APP scams. I'm Mick Morris, the product director at Clefi. Clefi helps banks and financial services organizations to predict fraud in advance of it taking place by using patented AI and ML technologies to identify threats and attacks well in advance of the fraud itself actually being executed. And we shift detection and response to the left in the customer journey. And we're pleased to host this webinar today in partnership with Transform Finance. We will be taking questions as we go through the session today via the Q&A feature in your panel. We'll either pick them up in the flow of conversation today, which should be pretty free-flowing, or we will have time towards the end to regroup on anything that we may have missed. There'll be a couple of polls as well as we go through. So we look forward to your engagement and feedback on those. You can see that the number of participants is still coming through, and people are joining, which we're grateful for. APP scams are part of an extensive and growing fraud playbook. They're carefully choreographed stories of manipulation, often quiet, calculated moves that slip past conventional defenses and stay hidden until the damage is done. And that damage looks like about $500 million in annual losses, not to mention the additional sort of operational cost. And that's just in the UK alone. I probably should say to pounds, actually. What makes them so dangerous is that they unfold across multiple stages and channels, often long before any money actually changes hands. And it's not just about spotting a suspicious transaction. It's about understanding the full story, the subtle signals of user behavior or session activity or device anomalies and transaction patterns that most systems can overlook. And we're primed for a great conversation today and diverse conversation. I'm privileged to be joined by two fantastic fellow panelists. We have Becky Holmes, who will share real stories from the front lines, showing devastating sort of human impact and the tactics that scammers use to manipulate victims. Becky's a well-known author and trusted voice in the anti-fraud space. Her book, Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You, dives deep into the emotional side of romance scams, showing us how trust gets twisted to devastating effect. And also, Lizzie Finlayson, Senior Fraud Manager at Monzo, is with us, who brings a wealth of experience and expertise. Lizzie will offer sort of the banking and industry perspective on fighting back. And I'll chip in and talk a little bit about how technology, particularly Clefi's technology, brings these attacks into the light, helping banks to detect and disrupt scams before they can escalate. Today, we'll pull back the curtain a little on how these scams really work, the tactics, psychology, the sort of technology footprints that they leave behind. Because when we understand the full attack chain, we can start to spot signals much earlier, reduce the impact, and explore new ways to stay ahead. This session is designed to give you a clearer view about how these scams unfold and crucially, how to catch them early. We'll share practical strategies and insights to help you move from reacting after fraud occurs to stopping before losses happen or escalate and your customers are affected. So to start, we're going to bring Becky on to sort of bring these scams to life. So welcome, Becky. As I said, Becky has spent years working closely with victims, hearing their stories firsthand, and so knows better than most about how these scams unfold and why they're so hard to spot until it's too late. So Becky, thanks, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I've appeared.
Yeah. Um, let's start maybe by talking about some of the real stories that you've seen and what they teach us about how scams work, how they unfold, really from sort of the human perspective. And I know your specialty, the book that you've written is on sort of romance scams. Maybe we start there. And so, why do romance scams work so well? And generally, I think it's interesting to understand what leads people to trust scammers.
Oh, well, when I was researching the first book, I came across this thing called truth default theory, and it's basically saying that humans we default to a position of trust, which makes complete sense. So if we didn't trust 90% of what happens every day, we would never get a partner, we would never buy anything from the supermarket. It's kind of our natural way. Our species would have died out. And I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that that's what happens. And in romance fraud in particular, most of us want to love and be loved. And again, that's our species would have died out if it wasn't for that. So romance fraud, it works so well because it plays on the most basic of human needs and how humans operate. And fraudsters know that.
Okay. Yeah, I think the challenge there is preying on that natural tendency that we all have every day.
Exactly.
Um,
This is it. There's a stereotype that victims of romance fraud are sort of, lonely and uh, unintelligent and kind of weeping because they don't have a partner. But actually, out of the victims that I spoke to, kind of 35, 40 victims, none of them were like that. So a lot of them had very good social lives, very good jobs, children that they were in regular contact with, good peer support. So they play on those kind of natural vulnerabilities, but not necessarily to people who are vulnerable. I think that's always a bit of a misnomer. You don't have to be a vulnerable person to become involved in a romance scam.
Interesting. We may come back to that point of vulnerability. What about outside of like the romance sort of scam variety? Like, is that same sort of natural human tendency that drives trust?
Yeah, I think so. I've been working on a second book, and it's much wider reaching than romance fraud. And I interviewed a couple who'd become involved in an investment scam. And a lot of people will say, well, investment scams, it's because of greed. So it's this kind of human chasing for money, which means that you might end up losing your money. And okay, fair enough. That is absolutely sometimes what happens. People want to make money. Um, this couple, there was a different vulnerability. So they wanted to get some money together to help their daughter, who happened to be in an abusive relationship. And they wanted to be able to get this daughter set up in her own place and away from this partner. So they had a very real reason for wanting to make money. And again, that it was a very real vulnerability. Now they ended up, the scam was so convincing, and they showed me screenshots and kind of emails from the fraudster, and eventually they ended up giving this fraudster access to their laptop, who is doing stuff remotely, and ultimately, I mean, the irony of that particular case was that their bank decided that something was going on here, and rang them up and said, can you come into branch? So they thought they were going in for some help. But the bank had called the police, and they were there to arrest this couple in their 70s. So there was some real miscommunication. But again, it all starts from kind of the trust and the vulnerability. It all starts from human nature. And I always think, I speak to some incredibly clever people every day in the counter fraud world who are like technological geniuses, but none of that matters unless you consider why people are becoming involved in these frauds in the first place.
Interesting. Is there maybe one or two other examples, maybe on the romance side, that of sort of real stories about how people get caught up in these scams?
Yeah, so one of the cases that sort of I guess broke my heart was I was talking to a lady on the phone, and at the time she had stage 4 cancer. And we were sort of chatting. She'd come across my Twitter account, and we were talking about what was happening with her situation, because she knew that she was part of a romance scam. And she'd been sending this particular chap, I think she'd sent him about £30,000. And she knew that she was being scammed, but by this point she was so embroiled in it, and she felt so bad for him that she kept paying the money. And she even went into her bank account, into her bank, to send these huge sums of money, hoping that she would be stopped, and nobody ever did. Now, I remember her saying to me the only time that her son was going to find out that she'd given all his inheritance to a fraudster was when she died. And a few weeks later, that's exactly what happened. And her son contacted me and said, I've just found this conversation between you and my mum on Twitter, and what's going on? And I had to explain it to him. But it's, for me, really interesting in that it just shows how, even when you know that what you're doing is, ill-advised, in inverted commas, you can be so emotionally embroiled in that you carry on. I liken it to, I'm an ex-gambling addict, and I liken it to that. You're putting this money in, and that it's a terrible idea, and that it's going to end in tears, but there's always that what if, and if I don't stop it, then I don't have to deal with what I've done. And that's what happens with a lot of romance fraud victims. But I guess victims of other types of fraud as well. You sort of ignore it until you have to. You have to face it.
That is fascinating. I mean, someone who is fascinated by how the brain works, right, and why humans sometimes do what they do. I find that very fascinating. What is the reaction when you speak to the victims? After the fact, what are sort of the things that they usually say after they've had these experiences?
Shame, guilt, remorse, sort of constantly asking, where do I go now? Who do I speak to? What do I get my money back? If so, how? And this is one of the things about fraud, and I will say probably romance fraud more so than any other, because there is this stereotype, there is this kind of stigma that goes along with romance fraud, but other sorts as well. You feel like you've been duped. You feel like someone's had one over on you, and nobody wants to feel like that. It's embarrassing. And particularly if it's something like a romance fraud where someone's actually had your heart as well, and you feel like they've made a fool out of you. So the emotional impact of fraud is far higher in many cases than the financial impact. When I've spoken to victims of fraud, they've said, you know what, they could keep my money, but I would like my peace of mind back. And it's because people then, when they've been a victim of a scam, and this is any kind of fraud, you start to doubt yourself, your own judgment, and not just financially, but kind of in any way. I know that when I've done something, if I've sent money, I sent money to a charity, an animal charity once, that turned out not to be a charity. And for some time, I wasn't only doubting what I was doing with my money, but I was thinking, have I heard that right? Have I, it has this kind of much.
Paranoia.
Yeah, it is like a paranoia.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, that's good because you've got your wits about you. But we need to have a balance.
Yeah, it's not great to live like that.
No, sort of permanently on high alert.
Let's look at it from the other side. I think one of the things you've talked about is interesting, in maybe the way the victims, feel about or get emotionally involved with the, let's say, the individuals or the threat actor in this case. But in your book, you highlight, organized crime groups, and so the organized sort of element behind these attacks. I think you refer to one group called the Yahoo Boys, and maybe many in the audience today might be sort of shocked at the scale and almost gamified nature that these that goes behind these scams. So can you maybe elaborate for us on how these groups operate, how they're structured, how they recruit, and then how they almost treat scamming like a career?
a career is exactly the word. It is how they make their living. It's why they get up in the morning. It's how they buy everything that they need and want.
Mm.
Um, yeah, when I first started researching, I knew that there would be groups of people working together. You know, it inevitably happens in anything really. But I didn't realize how monstrous these actual organizations are. So, you know, there are places in Accra in Ghana where they found scamming schools, for example. And the Yahoo boys over on the west coast of Africa and Nigeria, um, a lot of them work in a kind of pyramid scheme. So they will recruit a new scammer, show them the ropes, and then they will take a cut of their money, and so on down the chain. So it's not just these lone wolves or sort of groups of 2 or 3 people sitting in a room together. It's big business, and the money doesn't just go to the people involved. It also goes to fund other types of crime. So, you know, money from romance fraud, all fraud, of course, but it goes to drugs, guns, prostitution, other gang crime, pretty much anything nasty and nefarious. You know that the money, the proceeds are going from that. And you hear about organisations where, so for example, with pig butchering, the pig butchering scams, where people are actually trafficked and being forced to scam, and they're held in scam compounds over in Southeast Asia. It's organised crime beyond belief. So when we see these stories in the newspaper of, I don't know, Sheila, age 50, sent money to whoever, it's sensationalist, and it does nothing to show how big the problem is and how organised it is, and also how much it's growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is one of the things that we find in some of our own research. You know, our threat intelligence team do a great job often at working with clients and tracing back an attack, you know, right back to the infrastructure, let's say, of some of these groups. And what we see, you know, hopefully everyone can see the screen, is applications like this. You know, it looks and feels like any other business application would be used to using in our organizations, but in this case, it's a multi-channel social engineering platform, right, that is capable of deploying malware, managing mule interactions, for example. And so, you know, it's not just money behind the people, but there's a leveraging of technology and capability, you know, fraud as a service almost, that drives the sophistication behind what it is these groups are doing. And so I think your findings there in your research sort of align really well to some of the stuff that we've found. And in some cases, you know, maybe we're starting with the human element, some of the scarier things that we see, but that's all in the hope of, the more we understand, the more we can combat it, to your point, right? We understand like the drivers behind it, we understand the level of sophistication, and the sort of multifaceted nature of it, then we can actually fight back. So yeah, really, really fascinating.
And of course, one of the issues we've got is that with AI, etc., kind of being as absolutely incredible as it is, things are happening much quicker and with much more ease over on their side. So at the moment, we're trying our hardest to kind of keep on top of the new trends. So with romance fraud, for example, it used to be the case that you would say to somebody, look, if you can't video call that person, there's something going on. Whereas, of course, now you can have a video call with somebody. You know, real-time face manipulation is going to be absolutely huge. And therefore, anybody pretending to be, you know, Mark Johnson, US Marine, they can pretend to be him and talk as if they are. So some of the ways that we at one point were saying to people, this is a way to identify what's happening, they don't actually apply anymore, and that's kind of a frightening thing.
Yeah. It's got Lizzie. Do you want to just jump in here? If you got something to add to the comments?
Yeah, I think Becky's point is really valid here. Is that it's not just about kind of the conversations that people are having when you're talking about romance. I think all the elements and the psychology behind romance is used actually along most scams, in all honesty, but you really don't know who you're talking to on the other side. And I know, everybody's going to talk about deep fakes and AI, but it's still very prevalent on the other side when it comes to individuals where you think you know someone and you've seen pictures, you've seen them on the internet, you've seen them in social surroundings. It's no longer like if you've got 4 pictures on Facebook, there's a warning there. It's a lot more deeper than that now, and that's where it actually becomes incredibly difficult from my side, because when we do get to speak to those customers who may potentially be falling for any kind of scam, this person, you've spoken to them, about their family, you've shared kind of intricate secrets about your families, or the worries, especially money worries for everybody, is actually quite secretive. You keep any kind of mental and financial structure you have when it comes to money very much at home. You keep them behind closed doors. So when you do share them, it makes it very difficult. And in those situations, the banks, they're the strangers in this situation. And I'm the one that seems to be kind of trying to create doubt in the relationship that you may have spent weeks, months, years on. And I'm the stranger. So it's really interesting, because it's very difficult for anybody to really identify who you're speaking to, unless to the point you've physically stood in front of them with their passport, driving license, any kind of ID, and kind of interrogating them at any point in that relationship. It's very, very big struggle.
And can I make a point on that? So there's the lady that I spoke about who went into her bank and she wanted to be stopped. She was asked by her bank, "Do you know this person?" Now she said, "Well, yes." Because as far as she's concerned, of course she knows this person. She's been speaking to him for the best part of 18 months. So she answered that question very, very honestly. But the bank just said, "Okay, fine," and just let it through. So I think there needs to be something around the kind of questions that are asked, because that lady did genuinely believe that she knew this person. So when she was asked, she answered honestly. And the bank believed that to be the case. So they let the transaction go through. And it's also worth noting that that fraudsters do coach victims before they go into their banks, because they know the kind of questions that banks are asking. So I've spoken to victims who their fraudster has said, "Listen, when you go in, they're going to say this to you. And that's because they don't understand. So this is how you need to reply." So it is this sort of strange grooming that happens between fraudsters and victims. And that's something that, it's social engineering at its finest, really, but it's something that the banks have got a huge challenge with. So good luck with that, Lizzie.
We're definitely trying.
Just on that point, perhaps, Becky, maybe to finish off with this little first section before we transition to hear more from Lizzie. Does that same level of manipulation take place on the rise of, or I guess sort of the necessity that money muling has in this overall scheme as well? Could you explain sort of what money muling actually is, and perhaps share an example about how victims get caught up in that, perhaps, and equally manipulated in supporting some of this stuff, maybe sometimes even unknowingly?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example from somebody that I spoke to. Now, this lady had a relationship, believed she was in a relationship. And it was only about 2 weeks until she found out that this person wasn't who he said he was. Now, during that time, she sent him something like £400. So not a small amount of money, but also she could have lost a lot more. When she called him out, he said to her, "Right, okay, yeah, bang to rights, you've got me. Now, okay, fair enough, you've got no more, you've got nothing else to give me, okay, but I've actually had some explicit photos from you, and now I'm going to use everything in my power to get more money from you this way." She ended up losing £14,000 through the blackmailing part of it. And when she ran out of money, he started using her as a mule. So he would send money to her, he would send laptops to her, and he would get her to do things with them that he wanted. And it was a way of using her when she had nothing else to give. And you see this happening to a much smaller extent with even kids at school gates. You know, they're offered some money in order to do something. So I'll give you, if you can move £100 into this account for me, I'll give you 10 for your trouble. And it can happen at very, very big scales, but also, you know, very small scales with our own kids. There's a money muling is absolutely on the rise, and it's part of romance fraud, just like any other. There are so many times that I've spoken to victims and they haven't been able to pay their loved one, who they believed was their loved one. So they've done a favour instead, which is hold some money for them or transfer some money to a different bank account because, you know, their partner's locked out of his bank account or whatever it might be. So it's fraud isn't just about getting money from somebody. It's about, I guess, using somebody to do something for financial gain, and that includes money muling. And the emotional impact of that is pretty hard as well.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for highlighting. I think obviously those stories are often, you know, sad almost, right? The human element of them, not almost, they are, but we need to understand them because it's how we act. And so I think what's clear from that first part of our conversation is that it brings home how victims are manipulated broadly. And sometimes, you know, not interested in sending money, but also unknowingly being part of this sort of broader framework that exists. And you know, Lizzie jumped in, I think, at the right point, because that's where things start to get complicated. If we're only looking at, you know, one moment, right, the moment that a payment takes place, then perhaps all fraud starts to look a little bit the same. A transaction might tick a certain level of boxes, but if we zoom out, it could be part of something, you know, much bigger and deeper. So I think that's what we'll probably talk about as we go through the next little section. So at CleFi, we help banks across Europe and the UK and LATAM to uncover those sort of early signs. You know, our aim is to surface sort of the hidden threats, both the human and the sort of subtle technical signals that traditional systems might miss. But let's sort of switch now to hear more from Lizzie from OnZone. Thanks, Lizzie, for jumping in. I think it's a good way for us to get started. We've heard a little bit about how, you know, scams unfold from Becky, why they're hard to spot, and you pointed some of that out yourself. But let's talk a little bit about, you know, how that looks like from inside the bank or industry, you know, trying to defend against some of these real challenges before scams reach this point of no return. So what do you see in terms of why are things difficult? What are some of the tactics maybe that have changed over time, if they have? And how do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to speak to other people and their view of kind of how fraud starts. And many people kind of a few years ago would say if it's too good to be true, it's likely to be a scam. And that's not usually how it starts anymore. It's become, and Becky obviously touched on it, it is a business. You are talking to a very sophisticated business that has kind of resource, has technology behind it to make it actually difficult to spot a scam early, because they're roping you in with things like, you know, pressure deals are still a thing, and almost masking as a legitimate company, and therefore that is what makes it incredibly difficult to spot it early on. The kind of traditional do your Google searches and things like that, you actually need to kind of help customers a bit more and expand it a bit more to actually spot those earlier. From our perspective, that is the part that makes it challenging, is that one transaction, to your point, looks similar to another, and without kind of context, it is really difficult to identify what is a legitimate purchase against something that may potentially be a scam. You know, you don't want to get into a world of people being fearful of buying things online. We are a generation of you know, quick, easy, slicker, better way of shopping, and so you don't want to start putting in these additional hurdles into what is now kind of like a culture-based system. So it does make it extremely difficult. You've then got that additional that when we do stop it and we have the ability to kind of help or support people, you've then got kind of stepping onto what Becky was talking about a minute ago, kind of that social manipulation. And I think trust is a really difficult thing for banks to gain. You kind of have this undoing, we don't trust the banks, we don't like them, they're going to stop you for everything, and there's other points of view around that. And I think that is really challenging for us to break when we think you've been a victim, and it's getting that balance right of what is actually an interrogation versus what is actually supporting you. And I think over the years it has been difficult to spot them in a traditional kind of transaction monitoring way. You need your technology to keep up to date with the fraudsters' technology, and that's the only way you can kind of spot it earlier, is by something else that is helping you identify those factors. Without that, you are just looking at a normal transaction to a brand new payee, and that in itself isn't a good signal. It's not enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's a question, we might come back to it a little bit later, because it's part of the broader conversation about is transaction monitoring enough, for example, is one of the questions that came through. I think from our perspective, we've seen awareness campaigns have done okay. All banks, payment providers, governments, right, doing a reasonable job at trying to help people understand what they can look for. The challenge is, if we go back to this sort of organized crime nature of some of this, is these threat actors, they have targets they got to hit, and they will find ways, right? They'll find the soft spots in an organization's infrastructure or processes that they can exploit, and whether that shifts them, from social engineering to more technology-driven and oriented approaches, or back, right, depending on how banks respond, I think is a constant battle, right, that we need to navigate. And I think what you've raised there is really interesting, is finding the balance as a bank, let's say, of managing my risk, maintaining the optimal customer experience, and also managing any operational overhead that comes with actions that you take. So yes, certainly not simple, to Becky's point. How are banks or industry broadly thinking about earlier intervention? That's been something we've welcomed to see over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, is this big focus on early intervention, on prevention. So what kind of signals are you typically looking for, before or during what you think might be a potential attack, and what can you share with the audience about that?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few things that can be looked at. I'm in a very gracious area where we do get a lot of data points, so this isn't a kind of commands to everybody. But I think one of the big things that we'll look for is kind of unusual behavior, unusual contact. So it's less about the actual transaction itself, and it's more on the individual that you've got to start looking at in order to find those early signals. So you've got to look into kind of, if there's unexpected contact, so that's kind of prevalent for things like impersonation scams. If you have spoken to a bank or a police or anybody of the kind of that nature that was unexpected. The pressure tactics, so you may want to change something about your account and put a lot of pressure on for things that don't really resonate for what you're trying to purchase. So a good example is when you're buying a house, there's obvious pressure there. There's going to be pressure, and that's kind of usual behavior. You need to get your deposit over, and that creates pressure in itself. If it's something outside of that doesn't actually almost kind of resonate with the purchase you're trying to make, and that's very early doors, that is where you start looking into that user rather than that transaction itself. Kind of what is creating those pressure points? Why are we getting this sense of urgency? You obviously have unusual spending patterns, that goes without saying. So where people may have been buying more on card, and then they move to maybe a bank transfer or gift cards, anything crypto related, things like that, which may be deemed as unusual and maybe a little bit different for those individuals. And then you've got kind of maybe the contact details have been changed. There's kind of odd communications that you may have, and that all goes into that kind of user profile. You then have kind of the technology side of it, which Becky kind of broached on. Remote software is a massive thing at the moment. Even for, it used to be affiliated with unauthorized transactions. So you download and they kind of rinse your accounts. That's not how it works in authorized. People do say to you, in order for you to get the best investment or for me to help you, I need to have access to your account. And are you happy for me to do this? And they actually talk you through the journey whilst they're doing it on your own devices, on your own laptop. And it goes back into that kind of social manipulation of how, but that can be really good signals for any industry to use to kind of say, is this normal behavior? Is this something you'd expect for those individuals? And then you've got kind of the environmental anomalies. So are they changing IP addresses? Is the access somewhere different? If it's a new device, are you changing any network settings? Things like that. So you kind of move almost away from what I'd still deem as traditional kind of looking at the payment itself. Is it high value? And you actually look before that event and whether anything has actually changed. It's not a one size fits all. It is still extremely difficult to use those signals. But those are the kind of things that enhance your ability to try and spot it a bit earlier, is what has changed. And that's the biggest question that you can generally ask before payments start coming through.
Yeah, I love that response. I think that was actually really comprehensive. Some of the things that stand out and sort of resonate again from a ClearFi perspective is you've talked about lots of different parts of the user journey, right? Contact detail changes, changing spending limits, other types of interactions. You've talked a little bit about environmental anomalies, looking at device and whatever else. And from our perspective, the key point, I might touch on this a little bit later as well, is it's the correlation of all of those data points together that gives you the rich context from which you can then decide how to respond and how to tailor that to specifically what's happening in this particular scenario. What are the patterns that we're seeing? So I love that response. I think it's it was really comprehensive. So thank you for outlining that. I think there's some really good takeaways from people who are listening on that. I want to come back to a point that we touched on with Becky, and I guess as part of this idea of what are we seeing change. So we have seen changes, positive changes in industry, confirmation of payee, for example, having a bit of an impact on sort of fake mule accounts, but we still see that as a problem. So how do you think we can go about spotting those type of things early? Is it the same type of tactics and things that you've just talked about, or is there something different when we think about again the role of mule accounts, particularly when they're now legitimate?
Yeah, I think that's always an interesting question, and it's one that I get quite a lot. I think it's not just about fake accounts. I think mules actually also use real accounts. So sometimes they may purchase account details and kind of use it that way. Going to Becky's point, they may socially engineer you to convince you to obtain that account. I think there are a couple of things that can be done. I think they're slightly different to what I've just gone through. So behavioral metrics is one. The more we utilize kind of biometrics to access our account, the more you can utilize it in order to kind of have a look at those potential mule accounts. So they may have changed. There may be a slightly different variance on how those accounts are used. Digital footprint as well. You compare fraud patterns, including multiple accounts from one device or a history of fraud or a relationship between some of those. You've also got kind of advanced AI KYC. So the way the KYC is moving at the moment in industry is trying to keep up with technology. And I think the best way to try and protect from a muling perspective or a potential muling is by advancing that KYC approach through kind of digital footprints. You've also got kind of your traditional, you've got different postcodes, different addresses, different areas, you've got reputation, you've got email addresses and high risk domains and things like that. So those are what I would consider quite traditional views. But I think it really does come down from a muling perspective into that transaction monitoring, into that analytical behavior of established accounts. So how do you make sure that your accounts that may kind of a couple of months ago look absolutely kind of normal spending, and how do you start identifying those as potential changes into that mule activity? So again, that may be kind of device login, that may be large transfers coming in and out of new payees and receiving and forwarding money from multiple spenders. But a big thing is definitely that kind of, again, that biometrical kind of profile of have those details or have any other details been used elsewhere. And again, it may be that that individual may be a victim of ID theft in themselves. There may have been a compromise or a bot somewhere, and that's how you have to gauge those kind of mules. Is again, it's that what has changed, if anything. But for new mules, you may need something a bit more enhanced at that due diligence stage right early on. It is quite, again, we go back to that balance. It is quite difficult because you don't want to start having a 4-day KYC to get a bank account. But again, it's what can you use on an already existing data metrics that may help you in kind of growing what a typical mule would look like in a new account versus what it would look like in a changing account.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the response. At least my high level takeaway from that is the interconnected nature of these things, right, is really important. And so being able to understand that your AML and your KYC and your fraud and your transaction monitoring and the need for multiple layers across that is really important. Maybe just one last question before we sort of bring Becky back in and move towards wrap up. On that topic of the interconnected nature of how this stuff needs to work from a defense perspective, what role does collaboration between fraud and cybersecurity teams play in detecting and stopping these types of scams, but then fraud generally?
Yeah, so especially in my experience, our relationship with cybersecurity is essential. You need to work with security teams. If you don't, please do, because they give you kind of a level of information that I certainly wouldn't be able to get on your own. So things like a holistic view. So they'll see how attacks start. And again, I go back to kind of those data points of device and network. They may see something before we see it in kind of mass, and that gives you that kind of full picture of actually where does it start in your ecosystem. You've got that kind of shared intelligence. You've got unique data that they have, and we certainly have in individual cases, and that is massive. So shared intelligence is absolutely where it was. The other thing to bear in mind with security is you can get a faster response, and I think that's really key. Especially in my experience, we tend to want to understand individual victims. We want to understand the activity and the transactional activity. What security can do can actually give you kind of that secondary review of how can we look at it a bit quicker in that sense of maybe remote access is across lots of people, and it is enabling that rapid intervention before any funds are lost from other people. So it's absolutely, I cannot emphasize this enough, it is absolutely essential to work with security teams because they give you a completely different view on what may be deemed as kind of just pounds and pence and volumes. They'll give you that kind of intricate level of information from a data perspective that happens maybe as soon as you open the app, before you've made the payment, when you've added confirmation of the pay. All of those is where it will come to fraud and cybersecurity.
That's great, and I think we would definitely affirm that. There's a lot, and we won't go into this. We don't have time today. There's a lot being talked about in the industry around data sharing, and I think that's super positive. It's being driven by regulation, it's being driven by industry, and it's great. But there is low-hanging fruit in your organizations sharing data across departments, and I couldn't agree more with the points you made. All right, so let's move into the sort of last part of our conversation, and we'll bring Becky back in. If anyone has any questions as we sort of head into this last part, please by all means add them to the Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up if we have a chance. I think what we've talked about is great. We've seen some of the human side of things. We've seen how these attacks unfold from the victim's perspective, how they think about them, how they respond to them. We've seen some view from the organized crime and the attacker side, and And Lizzie's done a great job about giving us that sort of multifaceted, multi-layered defense view to combat what is ultimately a multi-layered approach to attack. But if we sort of wrap this up and look at what's happening to customers, how we're defending, the role technology plays, let's just maybe move into the last part of what we'll talk about today. And Becky, maybe for you, but Lizzie, your comments are welcome. We talked a little bit about the difference between support and interrogation. I'm interested to just get a view, from your perspective, what do you think additional support or protections could be provided sort of by industry at large as it relates to, either vulnerable customers, but I know you talked about that wasn't always the reality is not always the same as perception there. But what are some of the protections that we could look to add to support individuals in these problems?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because of course a lot of the time people they don't want advice from a bank. They want to go in there, they want to get their stuff done, and they want to leave, and they don't want to be told what to do with their money or anything like that. And I get that. I think the feedback that I've had when people have been victims have spoken to banks is that banks don't speak to them with as much respect as they need to. They're not perhaps trained, the kind of front of house staff, if you like, aren't trained to deal with what is essentially quite an emotional issue. And I think one of the issues we have around fraud is that there is no victim care. So we're told to any type of fraud, you have to send it to action fraud. And I'm fortunate that I don't work for anybody, so I can say in my own view, it's awful. So you're not going to get any emotional support there. A bank can't really provide you any emotional support. So what we need to do is be signposting people to the right places, and that includes banks. And we need to be looking at getting more victim support in place. In romance fraud terms, there's not a single funded support network for romance fraud victims. A friend of mine, Anna Rowe, works with one of the girls from the Tinder Swindler, and they've set up an organisation called Love Said, which helps victims of romance fraud. But again, it's not funded. It's two people doing it in their spare time. So I think banks need to be signposting to the correct places. They need to be teaching their staff that there's no point just sending somebody out having, ticked a box. There's no point saying, "Are you all right, love? Off you go." I think it's also important to know that banks, they can call local police and ask for a check, ask for somebody to go in and check. So I've had that before, where I've spoken to somebody who the police have turned up because they've gone into their bank, they haven't wanted to hang around and be signposted anywhere. And the bank have been very, very concerned and actually made a call to the local police, who've gone in and spoken to them. None of these things are perfect. I'm fully aware of it. And, banks, it's not any bank's role to be a counsellor. But I think there is a need to be kind.
I am mindful of time. I'm going to just we have one poll that we will run. So if we can deploy the poll now, it's just to get a perspective from the audience on what portion of scams or fraud broadly do you feel have or do you think have both identifiable sort of cyber footprint. So if you can respond to that, that would be interesting as we just close out in the last sort of 5 or 6 minutes here. So thank you for responding to that. We'll share the results of that later. I can't see them on my screen, but it's certainly our perspective that, oh, here we go. Most people have said between 20 and 50%, or between 50 and 80% feel like there's a cyber element. So yeah, really good. 15% said over 80%, and the UK National Cybersecurity Agency suggests that over 80% of attacks that we see today include social engineering and cyber elements. And so I think that really reinforces the point that Lizzie made about collaboration and how important it is to take both a cybersecurity and sort of traditional fraud approach to the problem. Our perspective is that fraud is part of the cyber war, and there's a lot that we can learn and leverage from information security and cybersecurity approaches to the fraud problem space. Many incidents that are sort of classified as APP often include indicators of remote access, which we've talked about today, even if it's just for watching, right? I think, Lizzie, you talked about that, and guiding people. It could be prior credential stuffing. Even malware gets a role to play in this. And so we've talked about the fact that the threat actors have a lot at their disposal. And maybe the last question, I think we don't have time to explore this in any detail, but we have touched on it in our conversations and prep, and I think is relevant to this point, which is what, very, very briefly, because we could talk about this for hours, but let's touch on the role that AI maybe is playing on both the attacker and the defense side of things. And again, just a 2-minute headline, and maybe we can pick this up for another webinar at some point. But Becky, Lizzie, how do you see this playing out? The advent of,
I can do mine in one word. Don't need 2 minutes. I need one word: nightmare. Given that the trust thing, it used to be seeing is believing. So humans kind of, we have this thing where we see something and therefore it's more credible. AI has changed all of that. And you look at kind of things like sim farms where you can send out something 1,000 times as opposed to just once. I think there are some amazing AI applications out there, I have to say, and there are some people doing some incredible things. But from a romance fraud perspective, I'm fearful of AI.
Lizzie?
Probably a bit of on the fence, I'm afraid. From where do I think fraud's going? AI is extremely dangerous. And I think it's absolutely echo Becky's point. I think from an industry perspective, it can be incredibly useful. And I think it's how you use AI to adapt and how you kind of embrace it into a world that fits in your infrastructure, that works for you, that is really kind of valuable. It has good points and negative on both sides, but as fraudsters have started to use it, and I know this is an age-old cat and mouse game, you've got to be able to embrace it rather than kind of reject it from a prevention point of view. And it's more, how do you utilize it to the best of your abilities to kind of protect people better, because it has some useful tools around it. I'm not saying it will solve everything, but I definitely think it has some benefits on prevention side.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think there's certainly we see both sides of the coin, so to speak. There is some, Becky, your point around nightmare, I think, is validated by some of the stats we see, right? Just how efficient it is making the delivery of scaled social engineering campaigns and these sort of things. But equally, Lizzie, I love your point that it's not a silver bullet to defense either, but it has to be part of the way we combat that. I think there's a good question in the chat about the shift in fraud tactics, and the reality is there are daily, weekly new attack patterns surfacing, and the traditional risk scoring models that require lots of label data have challenges responding to the frequency of change in attack patterns that will be exacerbated by AI. And I think taking a more sort of granular deterministic view, using AI to look at across multiple layers of the customer journey, and look at very specific attack vectors and correlate information patterns with each other, I think is certainly part of the answer. I think AI gives us on the defense side the ability to start to leverage some of those things. And Lizzie, I think you sort of encompass a lot of that in your response earlier.
I spoke to somebody earlier this morning who said that one of the best things for AI from a counter fraud perspective is that AI can actually find where scammers are evolving their tactics and kind of react to them much, much quicker than we've ever been able to before. So rather than a human going through and saying, oh, I noticed this, I noticed that, this behavioral metrics, they're actually able to find out how scammers are shifting, which I think is, in this kind of cat and mouse game, as Lizzie says, it's vital.
Yeah, great. There are some questions. We have answered a bunch of questions along the way, but we only have a couple of minutes left for me to wrap up here. So I will work with the team to take the questions that have come through, and we can put them in the response to the resources and things that we'll send after this. So really appreciate everyone's engagement. I think what's been clear to me from this session is, I'm just going to show my screen quickly. What's sort of clear from this session is that fraud isn't necessarily a moment, right? It's a process, and stopping it means understanding every step of the journey, from sort of the first contact to the final click. We can't rely on just sort of post-payment analysis that leads to attack scaling and significant losses, as sort of evidenced by this chart. And we can't always also assume that these things that Becky's really outlined very well for us doesn't just start with some random phone call. There's a lot of sophistication and organization that goes behind this. The new wave of fraud is sophisticated, it's data driven, and often hiding in plain sight. But if we can join the dots between behavior and device intelligence and session-based signals, malware, a lot of things that Lizzie encompassed in her response earlier, we can stop scams before money moves, or very much mitigate the scale of the problem. So identifying and characterizing these things early, focusing on threats and attacks rather than irrespective of how fraud might be labeled from a topology perspective, we can achieve these things together as before campaigns get out of hand. So thank you for everyone who's engaged. We will special thanks to Becky and Lizzie for bringing real world insight and honesty to the conversation today, and thanks for all of you for joining us. We'll follow up, like I said, with key takeaways and resources and answers to questions that we didn't get to as part of our conversation, and we look forward to continuing that conversation with you in the coming weeks and months. So thanks very much.